Last night we watched America and the Holocaust, and Dad had a lot of very interesting things to say about their own really miraculous journey to the United States, and we wanted to capture that on film. So that's what we're doing. So Dad, you want to tell us the story of how your family and how Mom's family got out?
Yes, I think I can start with when Hitler came into power in 1933. My mother recognized the problem right away and wanted to emigrate right then. My father at the time was 45, had a daughter who was let's see, in 33, she would have been 10. My brother would have been 5, and I was 4. Actually, my sister was probably around 12. In 33, I was 4. Harold was 5, and Edith was 11. My father he had been a volunteer in the First World War. He had established himself after the war, and of course had to be financially responsible before he married my mother in 1922. So he had just become established and was reluctant to leave, recognizing that, as everyone else, that Hitler might be a transient affair. But of course we know it wasn't. So our exodus really started in 1937, around Christmas time. My father went to meet with his colleague in Berlin in the Department of International Finance, who asked my father, he said, "Fritz, let's take a walk in the park." So Fritz and my father Fritz and this non-Jewish gentleman took a walk, and the man told my father, says, "If this conversation were overheard, you and I are both dead men."
Wow.
The man told my father, "Get your family out. Things are not getting better and are going to get worse." So Dad Fritz went home to Karlsruhe, and around the New Year's took my mother for a walk and said, "We must get out." And so plans were made. We were fortunate to have my dad must have planned ahead in some way, I don't know when, but he had affidavits guaranteeing that we would not be burdens, financial burdens in America, from my maternal grandmother's brother, who lived in San Francisco. At the time, Edith, my sister, was in England. She had, my parents sent her to England, I think around 1935, for a high school education. Maybe it was 36. And she established herself very well in London, had many friends, was getting a wonderful education, and every Friday night had a Friday evening dinner at Rabbi Hertz's home, Rabbi Hertz being the chief rabbi of the British Empire and the author of the Pentateuch, which was the standard uh, uh, translation of the five books of Moses and the Haftorahs, which were used really and are still being used, but were replaced a few years ago with a new edition. The short and the long of it is that my sister did not want to go and was very happy. And by some means, my father convinced her that he really wanted his entire family together. Well, because my sister was in England, the visas that had been granted only covered my parents, my maternal grandmother, my brother Harold, and myself. So when Edith decided to join us, Dad Fritz went to Stuttgart and had a meeting with the consul and said, could he not issue a visa for my oldest child? The man, as Fritz told me, looked him in the eye and said, we Americans are not in the habit of separating families. This was very different from the attitude of the State Department after the chief of the Immigration Service long issued edicts to severely restrict and, in a sense, stop Jewish immigration from most of the European countries. So, at any rate, plans were made, and we were able to take out our furniture and our belongings, but no money. And so my mother bought lots of stuff, including a trousseau for my sister, with sheets and pillowcases and whatnot. And I wasn't part of the packing, which took place in the last weeks of July and August. I was with a friend, Peter Goldschmidt's family, for 6 weeks after school had let out. And a servant that we had visited me on August 16th, 1938, and said I should come home. I went home, but the home was empty, and we slept over at the neighbor's house. A neighbor's house on the Heidenplatz, where we lived on number 8 Beethovenstrasse. And the next day, August 17th, we boarded the luxury train, the Rheingold, which ran from Cologne in the north to Basel in Switzerland, and was the crack train. August 17th was the day we left Germany. And in retrospect, I found out that August 17th was a very important date. A official in Germany issued an edict that as of January 1, 1939, all Jews' papers and their passports and their official documents must carry the name of Jacob for the man and Sarah for the woman. Our passports were issued before that date and don't have that name, but I'm sure that Eve's passports, and their parents did have, but those were lost, and I have not seen them. The reason I mention that as far as is known, this is the first time in recorded history that a government intruded itself in the naming of children. That, insofar as I know, had always been a private matter, and up to the family to choose names. Here the Hitler government inserted itself, making sure not only that the passport said Judah, but that the papers had Jacob for a man and Sarah for the woman. Interestingly enough, from the patriarchs, those were not husband and wife. Sarah was Abraham's wife, and of course Rebecca and Leah were Jacob's wife. At any rate, we embarked, or got the train in Karlsruhe on the 17th of August, went to Switzerland, and stayed there for a month while we were waiting the departure of our ship, the New Amsterdam, which left Rotterdam on September the 17th. We stayed in Switzerland, and I recall that we were all together in this hotel, and we could see a mountain, Mount Julia, Julia, and I don't know where it is now and where we stayed, but Edith and my father decided one morning to hike the mountain and return that evening. And I remember very vividly that I was anxious, and that I was very concerned that the family stay together and that nothing should happen before we completed our journey. We then left, I imagine, about, I would say, maybe around the 15th or 17th of September. We left Switzerland, and by way we had to have transit visas through France and Belgium before we arrived in Rotterdam and where the ship was. But we spent, as I recall, about a week in Amsterdam visiting relatives of my parents. We boarded the ship. The ship departed on September 17th, 1938, but that was a Saturday, and excuse me, and Mother, being very religious, as was her mother, my maternal grandmother, would not board a ship on Saturday. And so they arranged, as my mother had a way of doing, that we boarded the ship on Friday evening before the beginning of Shabbat. And the ship, and then we sailed. Interestingly enough, between September 17th and September 24th, when we arrived in New York, there was a hurricane, a very significant hurricane, which battered the eastern coast of the United States. I have a video documenting that hurricane. It was a disastrous one. and it, of course, affected the weather in our ship. And I know I saw my first movies on that board ship. One was called Three Loves Has Nancy, and the other was Test Pilot. And I remember that I remembered those movies, not Three Loves Has Nancy, but Test Pilot. And the ship rocked, and I ran out of the theater and did my thing overboard, as did many other people. My brother and I also played shuffleboard, and because of the rocking of the ship, the what are they called?
The little things you shuffle. I don't know. The little pucks or whatever.
Pucks or whatever kept going overboard, and we went back, I think, 3 times to the purser to get a new set. At the last time he told us to go to hell, which was one of the words I learned at that time. We also were on board ship with Thomas Mann and his wife, and also the Weil family, John and Robert Weil, who became friends. And John Weil and I are still very close to this day, he living in Orinda in California. But so those, and Thomas Mann and his wife, our departure from Germany was no big deal, but Thomas Mann's departure was a great blow to the Nazi regime. He, being non-Jews, famous already at the time, had decided to also emigrate to the United States. And as another aside, his son became a violin teacher. He was a violist in the San Francisco Symphony, but taught violin. My brother took to it very well. I studied with him for 6 years, and of all the failures of my life, this has to be one of the significant ones. I could play the slow movements, but my fingers didn't move fast enough to play allegro, and so I would play slow movements of the Vinyasky violin concerto and Vivaldi's violin concerto. Those I could do, and I had a fairly good tone of those, but allegros, no way. That aside, those are the only people aboard that I recall. And then we landed in New York on September the 24th. And that was a Saturday. And we unloaded our baggage. And my mother said, well, I'm not getting off the ship till the end of the Shabbat. And the official from the Holland American line told my mother, well, lady, you either get off or you're going back to Rotterdam because we're leaving. She got off. As we went through customs, the customs saw my sister's, Edith's, gramophone. What is it?
The accordion?
Accordion. And it was a Hohner, Hohner, I think, which was best make and a very nice accordion. And the official questioned us whether we were bringing this in for sale, and my sister said, no, I play the accordion. And the official said, well, show me. So she took out the accordion and played God Bless America. Where and how she learned that, I have no idea. When when we landed, uh, 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 my sister, being all of 16, uh, was the big person in my life, and she knew English. So while my parents were getting settled in the hotel, she took us on a bus tour of New York,
Wow.
where she had never been. We went to the top of the Empire State Building. We went to the, what was it, the center where the Rockettes were?
The Radio City Music Hall.
Music Hall. And we felt in the company of a very competent adult, she being 16.
What an amazing person.
And and one of the striking things I remember was that as we were in the bus, we were stopped because there was a parade. And the parade and the slogan and chanted just said, "Down with Hitler, Chamberlain must go. Down with Hitler,
Wow.
Chamberlain must go." And I don't know how I knew it at the time. I knew that Chamberlain was English, and the English were our friends. The Brits were our friends. Hitler, of course, is self-evident. And it turned out that this was the days after the Chamberlain had signed the Munich Accord, coming home to Britain with this piece of paper saying, "Peace in our time," having surrendered parts of Czechoslovakia to the Germans. So I remember that episode very well. We stayed in New York with relatives for about 3 weeks, and then took a ship, the City of Newport News, through the Panama Canal to San Francisco. And the reason we did that was that my father could pay for the ship journey in German marks, but could not pay for trains from New York to San Francisco. So we went through the Panama Canal, and I remember the locks and the little locomotives very well. And then we stopped at Acapulco. And at Acapulco, first of all, young boys came in canoes to the boat and shouted, "Lady, give me money, lady, give me money," and people dropped coins down there. Then we went walking in Acapulco on a dirt street, and I remember that very well, filthy with sewage on the sides, and because we were coming from the boat, from the ship, we were being followed by people who wanted to sell us trinkets. And one little boy came by and he said, "You've broken to my brother, you've broken something he was carrying, and you must pay me for it." Well, my brother didn't break it, and I don't think we paid for it. It was an interesting, the ship, the City of Newport News, which went from New York to San Francisco, was a freighter, but it had room for 11 passengers. So our family made up 6 of these, and I learned some of my English on that. That was a 3-week trip. We left, I forgot when, but we arrived in San Francisco on November 1, 1938. As I recall, it was the day after Halloween. and sailing through the Golden Gate. In the morning we were up, it was 5 or 6 in the morning, and when we first saw the Golden Gate, and then as we went through it, the sun was up, and it was a gorgeous sight. One other thing I would say from that, what I remember from the City of Newport News, that there was a pathway that we had to go from one place to the other, and there was one of the crew behind me, and he says, "Go ahead." Well, I knew by that what right and left was, but I didn't know what ahead was. So I learned. Anyway, it was an interesting trip, and I remember one thing on it was there was a maybe I would estimate a tank, canvas covered, maybe 10 feet by 6 feet, which you could swim in. And we went into that tank, which was the pool of that freighter. Well, maybe that's enough for this day.
Do you remember the other 5 people on that ship? Because you were so close for 3 weeks.
No, I don't remember anything about
Yeah.
that. I remember one thing, I made a paper boat out of newspapers, which one you could do, and I put a string on it, and I thought I could hang it out of the porthole on a long string and have it sail along with us in the ship. That was not a successful experiment. The boat never got to my newspaper boat never got into the water, being flying behind us on the string next to the boat.
Well, that sounds like fun. Well, this was terrific. You've got such a memory, Dad. It's just amazing.
So this rambling.
Oh, I don't think it was rambling at all.
Well, it was. Were very. The reason we looked at this last night was in our living room where we watched it. There is a model of the New Amsterdam, which was the ship that took us from Rotterdam to New York. In my study, I showed my wonderful daughters a model of the Rheingold train that took us from Karlsruhe to Basel. Had we waited, we left August the 17th, as you know, after Kristallnacht on November 9th of 1938. Whether we would have gotten out at all is problematic. And those Jews who remained after 1942 in Germany took a one-way train to their deaths in the extermination camps in cattle cars. So the contrast between our exodus and the fate of 6 million Jews is incredibly fortunate. And I keep this ship and the train and a book on the Holocaust from the Holocaust Museum, which interestingly enough has a picture of one of the cattle cars, and the name on the cattle car is Karlsruhe.
Wow.
And my journey to America was almost a cruise, and then my education in the United States was an excellent Alamo grammar school, Presidio Junior High School, wonderful George Washington High School, one of the best colleges in the United States at the time, University of California at Berkeley, and medical school at Harvard. So my education couldn't have been better, preparing me for a wonderful, successful life in the United States, and blessed with a simply wonderful wife and wonderful children with wonderful husbands and grandchildren. So the contrast between what my life turned out to be and what the life of the man who was in the documentary, Kurt Klein, who with his brother and sister tried vainly to get his parents to the United States, not succeeding because of the inhuman and the blocks to the issuance of visas, which is so clearly documented in that piece, The America and the Holocaust, that a day does not go by when I don't reflect on how fortunate even I were to be able to get out with our family and enjoyed a wonderful life in the United States.
You were saying that your dad actually had a conflicted thing. That he sponsored 120 people, but also
yes, that was another thing. We left, as I mentioned earlier. My mother wanted to leave early on 30th year. My father wanted to establish himself, was established, did not see that it was as crucial as my mother did. My father was highly recognized and respected in the Jewish community of Karlsruhe, and he felt that by leaving late, he gave a false message to many other Jews in Karlsruhe who stayed longer because Fritz Simon had stayed. And because of that, my father felt very guilty about this episode of leaving late, when he spent the first 3 months in this country going to all of our relatives and contacts of our relatives, getting as many affidavits as possible for people to emigrate from Karlsruhe. And as I recall, he was successful in getting 120, of which about 60 actually were able to emigrate. But apparently about 60 did not, and they perished in the extermination camps. And I have one envelope of one of the letters that was returned from the internment camp in France, in Vichy, France, called Gurs, G-U-R-S, which is also mentioned in the America and the Holocaust documentary. And the envelope came back with a stamp, address unknown. And my father related this episode to me, and that he, throughout his life, felt that had he left earlier, more Jews from Karlsruhe might have been saved. So.
Thanks, Dad. This is really wonderful. It's been terrific.
We We better
join the Eve and everybody else for breakfast. But we'll do some more next time.
We have to leave shortly. Thank you, Carol.
Thanks,
for
Dad.
wanting to do this, and to at least leave a record as to how lucky, because Carol, Lori, Renee, and all the grandchildren would at least have different parents had not this non-Jewish colleague of my father around Christmas 1937 taken my father on a walk in a park outside the offices in Berlin.
We've been very lucky.